What really happened with your host, Mike Rivero. The history the government hopes you never learn. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It is Friday, March 31st, 2017, end of the week, end of the month, and tomorrow, of course, is April Fool's Day. We don't do that sort of thing around here for the obvious reasons. We have lots of stuff to talk about today. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Mike is in our control room, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble, ready to answer the phone when you call on in. And, of course, today being Friday in hour number 3, the lovely Lady Claire will be joining us with her unique perspective on the world. Now, getting right on into it, there's been a fire and bridge collapse in Atlanta, Interstate 85. Fire started. They still don't know what started the fire, but it burned for 20 minutes, and then the bridge overhead collapsed. And I'm waiting for Rachel Maddow to come on and insist that she found Vladimir Putin's cigarette lighter near the blaze, the way the corporate media tends to do these things. There's been an interesting development in this whole Hillary Gate, email gate, whatever you want to call it. And apparently Chuck Grassley has revealed that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and 6 of her aides still have access to top secret and classified information. Now, the way the rules are supposed to work, when you are involved with anything involving classified information, you have to be vetted, you have to get a security clearance, you then have to follow the rules on the proper handling of the classified material, which Hillary didn't. She was very careless. I mean, that's what she's saying. I think something else was going on. But for the moment, we will stipulate that Hillary Clinton is a very careless person with classified information. Then, when your job is over, you surrender that information back to the originating body, or you certify its proper destruction. And your security clearance at the higher levels is revoked. It can be reinstated, but it's revoked. You're not supposed to have access to classified information if you're not in a job that requires it. And Grassley has now basically blown the whistle that Hillary Clinton and 6 of her aides, after she stopped being Secretary of State, still had access to top secret classified information. Why? That's a very, very big question. If she's not Secretary of State, if she's a private citizen, which is technically what she is while she was running for the office of president, she's still a private citizen today. She should not have access to any of that information. What is she doing with it? Now, for me, the big unanswered question remains. If Hillary Clinton, while Secretary of State, was selling classified secrets to foreign interests using her weak email server. Her private email server had very weak security on it. And the Guccifer had basically said when he was inside Hillary's server prowling around, he saw 10 foreign IPs logged in at the same time, just prowling around looking for things. So was Hillary selling that material? Was she using her charitable foundation to collect the payments? And it certainly wouldn't be the first time, because the Clintons did this back in 1994 with the Chinagate scandal. And now we're finding out that even after she is no longer part of the State Department, no longer officially a part of the government, she retained her access to these top secret and classified documents. Sounds kind of suspicious to me. All right, we're going to go ahead and take a phone call. Al in Canada, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. I hope you and Claire are well.
We are doing fine.
Great. Just a couple of quick things. The last couple of days I wasn't able to reach your website. I had to use a proxy. So I had to go into my router and change my DNS settings. I was wondering if you could maybe post something about that.
Well, here's the problem. We're under pretty heavy server attack, and I do have an automated system I put together, and sometimes it will erroneously flag somebody as a hacker who's merely hitting the server too hard. So go to whatismyip.com and email me the number that it shows you, and I'll make sure that you're not in the filters, okay?
Okay, I appreciate that. Also, you have that website stating that poll for Hillary and Trump.
Yeah, they changed the poll right after I ran the story.
Well, it's actually worse, Mike. I went into it about 3 or 4 times, and one time it was at like 15,030, Trump was at 20, and I went into it again, it was at 1515, and Trump was at 19. So they're deliberately shaving the numbers.
Of course they are. Of course they are. It's corporate media. What are you expecting? The whole thing was BS.
That's exactly what we expect.
Yeah, that's exactly. So, yes, the corporate media is lying to us again. Oh, and in additional news, the sun came up this morning.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mike. I appreciate your time.
All right, thank you very much. We're going to let you go here, do a quick shout-out to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining the network. We're going to be talking about that poll over at MSN a little bit further down on the talking point list here. But apparently Fox News is now reporting, apparently they have had somebody come to them who's a very highly placed source, not in the FBI, but very senior in the intelligence world, needs to stay anonymous so that they don't wind up in Fort Marcy Park. And basically saying that this unmasking of the names of people inside the Trump administration had nothing to do with national security. It's all about politics. And basically saying, the spying and surveillance started before Trump was even the official GOP nominee. They were watching him all along. And that, of course, is always the big question. We now know for a fact the Obama administration was spying on Donald Trump during the transition for political advantage, to know what he was planning, to try and figure out how to end run him or blockade him. And now the question is, were they spying on him during the campaign? And with this Fox News report, it looks like the spying on Donald Trump began even before he became the GOP nominee, before he won the primaries. So, yes, they were spying on a rival political candidate. This is Watergate all over again. And we need to keep pounding on this and keep forcing it out there about just how crooked this last year's election was. Now, Fox News had an interview with elections expert J. Christian Adams, and he used to be the voting section attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice. He's now an advocate for honest elections, and he is saying so far he and his associates have confirmed 4 million dead voters on the U.S. voter rolls voted last year. So between the 4 million dead voters, the 3 million illegal immigrant voters, Hillary's claim that she won the popular vote has just evaporated. Now, a very interesting little question being asked by Investment Watch blog. Is Russia interfering with the U.S. political system, or is it Israel? Yeah. Go on over and listen to those speeches at the AIPAC conference. Israel is openly tampering with our elections. They will pour huge amounts of money on pro-Israel candidates. They will move to get non-Israel supporters ejected from Congress. Just look at Cynthia McKinney. Everyone's screaming about possible Russian interference in our election system, and Israel's doing it out in the open. And the attitude seems to be, well, of course it's okay for Israel to tinker with our elections, you know. They're God's chosen people, and they're special, and we have to let them tamper with our political system, but Russia better not do it. Paul Joseph Watson is out there on Twitter pointing out something that's actually kind of obvious, but it's worth saying anyway. In the last 3 months, virtually everyone who helped defeat Hillary Clinton has faced either official oppression or media smear. Yes, they have. It was only about a month ago the Washington Post was claiming my website and dozens of others were arms of Russian propaganda. Insert ominous music here. And of course, we're not. We're just reporting the news. We're reporting the news Hillary didn't want reported. That's what's frustrating her. She actually thought she could run and win the White House and that nobody would be talking about all the Clinton scandals going all the way back to that CIA gun and drug running operation in Arkansas in the mid-1980s. And boy, was she wrong. There's a lot of people inside that establishment who are still not realizing how the Internet and the independent media has changed the fundamental nature of the way information flows through our society. They still dream that they live in a world where the politicians tell the media what to tell the people to believe, the media tell the people what to believe, and the people believe it. And that was, for the most part, true back in the 1950s and 1960s. That's not today. It's not even close to being today. And some of the people inside the establishment still haven't really picked up on that new reality. Story coming on out from the Gateway Pundit, confirmation. John Podesta's company was paid 1 billion rubles from the Russian government, that's about $35 million U.S., while he was advising Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. So here we have another example of a Russia connection that is actually documented, for which there is actually evidence, and everybody is looking over at Donald Trump. We've got to find something. We've got to find something. I was listening. Oh, we just lost our connection to RBN again. Over there. All right, well, I'm going to keep on talking about this. I was listening to the press briefing by Sean Spicer. And I kept hearing the same thing coming out from the assembled reporters. Sean Spicer is trying to talk about the facts, and the reporters are always saying, yeah, but the public perception is. The public perception is. These are no longer reporters. They're openly acting like propagandists. We forget the facts, forget the evidence. We want to talk about the public perception. The public perception that we are putting out is that Trump and Russia are working together. What are you going to do about it? And Spicer comes back with the facts that everybody who's actually been shown all the available evidence is saying there's nothing there. And the reporters keep coming back, yes, but the public perception that, and that's really the crux of it. Sean Spicer wants to deal in the real world, and the corporate media is still out there talking about the public perception, which they are manufacturing. And they are really, I'm sorry to stumble here, but I'm trying to communicate with our control room at the same time I'm talking to you. But they really are the embodiment of this idea of the post-truth world. They've even got a label for it. And the idea is we should all get used to the idea that we live in a society where truth and facts don't matter anymore. What's important is what we get you to believe, what your perceptions are. And if we control your perceptions, we control you. No, you don't, because I tend to be a person who looks at the facts and the evidence rather than what a talking head will say to me. Okay, something must have gone really wrong over there at RBN, and I don't know why. Everything else seems to still be working here. Yeah, we're still on the air on BAM user. Okay, I am not getting any reply at all from RBN, so we'll just wait until they come on back. All right, so BuzzFeed is now being sued for defamation regarding Russian interference in U.S. election. Actually, to be more accurate, they're being sued for publishing that discredited report from that British spy that Donald Trump and 2 prostitutes were doing golden showers in the presidential suite at the Moscow Hotel. Completely discredited. Never happened. But BuzzFeed ran with it because it makes Trump look bad. And so now they are being sued. And it is a reality that if you are running defamatory stories and you don't have your facts behind you, you can be sued. There is a legal defense called absence of malice, but in this particular case, that's going to be a hard sell. Now, the corporate media is trying to manufacture more news. As you know, Michael Flynn is getting ready to testify before the various intelligence committees. And last night we were seeing all these stories about, well, he should ask for an immunity deal so that he's not afraid to say anything. And then it was about, well, you know, the White House or the Department of Justice should offer him an immunity deal. And then earlier today they were saying Senate rejects the immunity deal. And as it turned out, neither Michael Flynn himself or his attorney ever broached the subject of an immunity deal. His attorney has come out with a statement saying, this came out of nowhere. We were not asking for an immunity deal. And it looks like they put out this idea that he's seeking immunity to just make it look like he did something wrong that he wants protection from. And it came out of, it was just another made-up fantasy. How do we make Michael Flynn look like he's guilty? Well, let's say that he's going after immunity. It never happened. It never happened, according to his attorney. It was just made up out of thin air. Okay. Now, CNN came out with a story that Russian activist, former deputy head of the Parnas Party, Vladimir Kara-Murza, had been poisoned and was in a coma. And basically, Manpur, in the analytical Manpur program, supposedly he's on the list of critics of the Kremlin who are being silenced. As it turns out, Kara-Murza is perfectly healthy, he's perfectly fine. He posted a current picture of him. In fact, apparently he just had a meeting with John McCain. So, more fake news. Now then, this is what the caller called in about. MSN earlier today put up this bizarre poll. If the 2016 presidential election were held again today, who would get your vote? And the numbers were obviously massaged because when I first saw the poll, they had Hillary Clinton 69%, Donald Trump 16%. Now, there really isn't much of a point to this poll other than to sell the idea that the American people have had a change of heart and they want Hillary Clinton in and Donald Trump out, possibly as a propaganda prelude to an actual coup d'etat that's being planned. Now, as I was looking at the poll, Hillary's numbers were dropping and Donald Trump's were gaining. When I posted it to what really happened, it was down to 66 to 20%. And apparently it continued that slide. And shortly after I ran this story, MSN changed the poll. Apparently they weren't able to keep inflating it to keep Hillary in the lead. But there's no reason to have a poll like that other than to try and sell the idea that the American people have changed their mind and really they've got electors' remorse and they want Hillary Clinton in the White House and they want Donald Trump out. More corporate media bovine excrement here. Now, yesterday we were talking about this. There we are. Okay, and we're back again, I guess, on the air for however it was we got knocked off. So yesterday we were talking about this law that was being proposed out in California to ban alternative media websites in the state. And obviously a lot of people were saying there is that pesky little thing called the First Amendment right to freedom of speech. And sure enough, the legislature has dumped that bill now. They've just thrown it on out. But the fact that they're even talking about laws to ban independent media tells you just how afraid they have become, just how influential the independent media is, and how scared corporate media is. Their revenues are dropping, their audience dropping, advertisers are leaving them, they're running on vapors over there, and they can't change their business model, which is we tell your lies for big bucks, and they're trying to find some way to get rid of the independent media. And this bill from California is just absolute proof that they're just ready to ditch the Constitution and the Bill of Rights to retain power over you. We're going to take a break for commercials here, try and figure out what was going on with our connection, and we'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. We're back on the air, not just on BAM User, but on Republic Broadcasting as well. And apparently the problem was the hamster in the little wire wheel. And for those of you who are not familiar with radio, our entire studio setup is powered by a little wire wheel with a hamster in it tied to a generator, and he runs and drives the little wheel in circles, and we get electricity from there. But the hamster's getting old and looking tired, so they thought adding another hamster might improve things. Unfortunately, they put in a female hamster, and so the wheel wasn't turning in circles anymore. It was just rocking back and forth, and they've corrected the situation, and we are back on the air. Claire's in the other room laughing. Anyway, so we were talking about this idiotic bill out in California. I'm going to repeat the story for the people on RBN. We were talking yesterday about this bill actually proposed in California that would ban independent media websites, or any independent media, anywhere. You will watch your corporate media. You will believe it. And obviously a lot of people said, there is that First Amendment, right to freedom of speech, freedom of the press. And the Supreme Court has consistently ruled freedom of the press applies to all technologies used to promulgate opinion and discussion, whether it's radio, TV, or the Internet. So the California legislature has now ditched that bill. But as I was saying before, the mere fact that they were trying to put such a bill through shows you how afraid the establishment has become of the independent media and how influential the independent media really is. So, there we are. Now then, let's turn over to the war zones, emphasis on the plural. Apparently, Syrian government forces have regained large areas in northern Hama, and apparently they now are looking, either are about to or have taken control of Mount Zain al-Abidin, which would give the government troops the ability to fire artillery at units operating in the area north of Kumana. So they're making progress there. This thing could very easily be over, and I think that's what Assad and Russia are trying to do, is end this whole nonsense before the United States can come on in and start talking about safe zones again, which Tillerson's already doing. You know, we need to carve a safe zone out of Syria so that the people unhappy with Assad can live there, which I guess would include John McCain and Nancy Pelosi and all the war hawks here. And I would be, you know, I got to tell you, that would be a really good idea. Let's carve out a little piece of the Middle Eastern desert and take all of our war hawks who think the Middle East is worth dying for and just drop them in there, you know, and we'll parachute in some food and water every once in a great while. And just let them, you know, if they want to fight over the Middle East, we'll let them go fight over the Middle East and leave the rest of us alone here. Now, Russia today, of course, is reporting on what's going on in Syria. And they were up near the strategic Euphrates Dam. And Russia today is saying they're seeing the U.S. so-called advisors right on the Raqqa front line. Advisors. We've heard that one before. We heard that in Vietnam. Oh, we're not sending your kids over to actually fight the war in Vietnam. They're merely advisors. And after we lost about 60,000 of those advisors, the war was over, and we had lost here. Very alarming development. The Pentagon will no longer reveal how many U.S. troops are in either Iraq or Syria. You don't need to know, because you gosh darn American people, you just have a bad habit of getting really upset at all of your children that we're sending to these places here, so we're just not going to tell you anymore how many are over there. Which tells us they're about to do a major escalation here. Now, the European Parliament did a fact-finding trip down to Syria, wanted to see for themselves if things were as horrific as reported in the Western media, and to nobody's surprise, found that the reality in Syria completely contradicts what is being reported in the European and American corporate media. And they were shocked by the scale of Russia's humanitarian aid into that country. All right, we're going to take another break for commercials here. We're going to get some vitamins into that giant mutant hamster, and we'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And I got an email request to finish the story I was on when we had our little hamster outage. And that was about John Podesta's company. It being confirmed that his company got $35 million from the government of Russia while he was advising Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. And the point I was trying to make there was we still have the corporate media and the liberals desperate to find something that links Trump to Russia so they can say he's a Russian agent, and all the while just ignoring as hard as they can all of these links between Podesta in Russia, Hillary in Russia, And really, the bias and hypocrisy is just really very, very obvious. There are real cases of collusion between Russia and U.S. political figures, and they're trying to make one up about Donald Trump. Now, getting back to the war zones here, yesterday we were talking about how Tillerson had made the comment that the future of Bashar al-Assad is going to be left up to the Syrian people. And apparently John McCain just flipped out at that. And he's now angry at Rex Tillerson for saying Assad can stay, and McCain is out there saying Assad should go, Assad should go, Assad should go. So I think over in Syria, they might be asking the question, is America interfering in Syria's politics? And I think the answer would most assuredly be yes. And that's another double standard. Because the U.S. is always interfering in other countries' politics, rigging their elections at least 81 times that we know of since the end of World War II, coup d'etats in countries, more than 50 attempts since the end of World War II, succeeding about half the time. And yet, the mere suspicion that somebody from outside might be tinkering with our political system, except, of course, for Israel, is a big, horrendous crime. Oh, my goodness, we can't have an outside country interfering with our politics, except, of course, Israel. So the double standards are really getting very, very obvious. Now, over in Mosul, as you know, the campaign over there has resulted in a huge number of civilian casualties, to the point where the Iraq forces have declared a temporary pause to allow the civilians to be evacuated before any more fighting takes place. And it's a big, big problem. Of course, here in the United States, the attitude is just get used to the idea that civilians are going to be killed in our wars. It's a small price to pay to bring democracy and humanitarianism to the people of Iraq. We're going to bomb those people until they're humane. Tillerson is also out on the warpath again against Russia, saying that the U.S. will maintain all Ukraine-related sanctions on Russia until Crimea is returned. They're still out there with this nonsense that Russia stole Crimea. And every time you go up to one of these people and you say, wait a minute, Crimea had a referendum to leave Ukraine following the U.S.-backed coup d'etat in Kiev, and then they had another referendum to merge with Russia, and they come back and say, well, Crimea didn't have the right to do that. Yeah, they do. Under the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which all member nations of the United Nations agree to, yeah, Crimea had that right. But that's the position. We refuse to recognize the right of the Crimean people to vote their own independence and vote to merge with Russia. Therefore, the default position is Russia has stolen Crimea. Now, that's like going to a wedding and finding one of the wedding guests refuses to recognize the bride's right to marry. Therefore, by default, the groom is guilty of kidnapping and rape. That is how ridiculous this logic is behind Russia stole Crimea. Meanwhile, the EUCOM commander, the commander of U.S. military forces in Europe, is calling for larger, enduring armored force to deter Russia. We've got to take more money away from the American people and build tanks and artillery and just park it there on the Russian border until we can get Russia to do something we can attack them for, or until it rusts into corroded piles of junk, which is where the vast majority of all the weapons that were built during the Cold War of the 1950s and 1960s went. They built all this expensive stuff, and it just sat there. And it was never used. And given that much of it was nuclear, we're glad that it was never used, but why waste the money in the first place? Out in Arizona, you can see this on Google Earth, there's a boneyard of American warplanes. It is huge. There have even been some TV shows done about it. And you can see this thing, and it's just square mile after square mile of all these very expensive warplanes that are just sitting there in the desert corroding away. Now just imagine all of that money being, instead of making this stuff to sit there in the desert and rust, had been put into, shall we say, upgrading the Oroville Dam, or reinforcing that bridge in Atlanta, or providing safe water systems to American cities, or things like that. And already we have the military-industrial complex saying, we want more, we've got to take more money away from the American people. To heck with clean drinking water and safe food and good roads and stuff. We can survive without that, but we need to have bombs. Reminds me of this wonderful quote from George Bernard Shaw. He wrote a book called Man and Superman, and one chapter out of it, The Devil and Don Juan, basically, it's a standalone piece. It's often done as reader's theater. And there's a wonderful quote in there. There's nothing in man's industry but his greed and his sloth. His heart is in his weapons. And unfortunately, that is sadly, sadly true. And there's a lot of greed tangled up with it. It's a wonderful scam. You create a threat. Russia's coming to get you. I remember the propaganda from the 1950s and 1960s. The commies are coming to indoctrinate you. No commies ever showed up at my door. When I finally actually met some people from the Soviet Union, they were pretty cool people. And the military-industrial complex took vast sums of money away from the American people, money that could have been spent on making our lives better. And they built bombs, and they built rockets, and they built airplanes that just never worked. Because they didn't need to. The scam all along is, we're going to build all this stuff, and it looks really impressive. It doesn't have to work, because we're never actually going to use it. And that's why today we have wound up with things like the Independence-class littoral combat ship, severe corrosion problems. The lead ship has already been dry docked to replace part of the hull. The Freedom-class littoral combat ships, drivetrain problems. The Zumwalt stealth, we hope, destroyer, drivetrain problems. The F-35, the F-22, the Gerald R. Ford may never actually be usable in combat. But they all soak up vast sums of money, and everybody who's in on that little scam is making their little piece of the action. And it's time to bring it to an end. Here's the reality of what's going on. We don't need to project power across the globe for reasons other than greed. We're always hearing, better to fight them over there than have to fight them in our streets. They'll never get to our streets. We've got 2 oceans protecting us and a nuclear arsenal. All the Department of Defense needs is the nuclear arsenal. They don't need any of this other stuff. Somebody annoys us, we drop a tactical nuke on them. And everybody will calm down afterwards. All of these carrier groups and ships and planes and drones are about invading other people's countries and taking them away from them. Taking their wealth, taking their political system, turning them into vassal states. And we've done it all over the globe. And that's why America is hated around the world. They don't hate us for our freedoms. They don't hate us because we've got Disneyland or Miley Cyrus or any of those other things. The rest of the world hates us because the U.S. government has a bad habit of going into other people's countries and messing around with them to benefit American corporations. That's why we're hated around the world. Now then, as you know, there's a big NATO drill getting ready to take place in Bavaria. I hope they don't tear it up too bad. Bavaria is a very lovely place. And those tanks have a bad habit of really churning up the lawns. But apparently, Germany is now recruiting Russian-speaking actors for the military drills in Bavaria. They want to get the soldiers used to hearing the Russian language, because we have to deter Russian aggression. I'm sorry, who is it who's rehearsing to fight against the Russians? Over in Russia, I don't think they're having drills where they're hiring people who speak Bavarian to play the OP4. It's very obvious who the aggressor is in this new rush to a new world war or a new Cold War. Actually, this war is already pretty hot in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen. Afghanistan. Now, there's a new development that I hope will give military planners a bit of a pause. It probably won't. What they'll do is scream is, we need more money to counter the new threat. Russia has been developing a new anti-ship missile. It's called the Zircon, and it is very potent. It flies at almost Mach 6. It's a hypersonic missile. I was looking at a video of it, and it looks like they've managed to field a working scramjet. And apparently it carries a warhead sufficient to destroy an entire aircraft carrier with a single hit. And it has a range that will allow it to be launched from outside the current standard defensive perimeter around a carrier battle group. And that is really a game changer. Apparently they've had a successful test flight, and they're going to be putting that into production. When you look at what Russia and China are producing, because their goal is making working weapons, not just looting the public for the military-industrial complex, I really do not think the United States can win an actual war against Russia or China. And that's a really good reason not to start one. Apparently over in Ukraine, in the city of Lutsk, the Polish consulate was attacked with an RPG rocket. Everybody's pointing fingers. Ukraine is saying it's Kiev Nazis, and everybody's blaming the Russians. It's amazing. Now, new development. Apparently, one of the regional parliaments in eastern Germany is planning to officially recognize Crimea as being part of Russia. And I'm sure there's probably a lot of phone calls being made over there in Germany right now to try and tamp this down. But at some point, somebody's got to take a stand and put an end to this Russia stole Crimea nonsense, because that's all it is. It's a load of nonsense. And we're risking a world war by continuing on down this path. Meanwhile, U.S. Army General Joseph Votel is saying that the U.S. should use military means against Iran because Tehran is the greatest long-term threat to stability in the Middle East. I'm sorry, remind me again, just who has all their warships and carriers throughout that entire Gulf region? I don't think it's Iran. They've got their little coastal patrol boats. They're glorified ski boats is really all they are. Who's got Aegis cruisers and carriers and destroyers and guided missile frigates and everything in the area? I don't think it's Iran. It's the United States that is provably the biggest threat to stability in the Middle East, because they've destabilized Iraq, they've destabilized Yemen, they've destabilized Libya, they're destabilizing Syria. Iran hasn't done anything. Iran has not initiated a war of conquest against another country in over 200 years. They're on the U.S. government's special high-interest targets list because they refuse private central banking, and they want to sell their oil for currencies other than the dollar. That's it. And, of course, Israel wants Iran broken into little tiny pieces that are easy to bully and push around, like they're getting ready to do to Syria, Turkey, and Iraq with the creation of the new Kurdistan. Even Tehran has come out and said, you know, maybe if you want things to calm down and be more stable in the Middle East, the U.S. should get its assets out of the Persian Gulf. It's not the American Gulf. It's the Persian Gulf. We have all these American weapons of war running along the borders of countries in the Middle East and then screaming that those countries are the reason there's tension in the area. Now, the U.S. is warning China that they are losing patience over North Korea. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations said China can and must do more to force North Korea to halt its nuclear and missile programs. This is coming from Nikki Haley. Well, China has already said that they're not at all happy with North Korea. But China has this idea that maybe countries ought to be allowed to kind of just sort of do what they're doing. Now, obviously, the nuclear weapons are an issue, but nuclear weapons are usually built and stockpiled as a deterrent. Remember when we were going through that first Cold War in the 1950s and 1960s, and the U.S. and Russia were building all these city buster bombs, and we were told, that's cool, it's deterrent, mutually assured destruction. We're going to build all these nuclear bombs. Nobody would ever use them out of fear of retaliation. And I'm pretty sure that's why North Korea wants a nuclear bomb, to deter an invasion of their territory. North Korea is not going to initiate a nuclear attack against anybody, because the result would be North Korea melted into a giant slab of green glowing glass. They want the nuclear weapons for deterrence. What the U.S. wants is to disarm North Korea to make it easy to invade. Now, Trump is having a summit with Chinese leader Xi Jinping next week, and that's probably going to be very, very tense. We're going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And it's kind of interesting. We've seen the United States use this thing, the threat of nuclear bombs, and Saddam's nuclear weapons, and now it's North Korea's nuclear weapons. And there's an important point you need to keep in mind in all of this discussion. Because for all this talk about Saddam's nukes and Iran may be getting nukes and North Korea's got nukes and we've got to be afraid of all these people, in all of history, one and only one nation has ever actually used a nuclear weapon of mass destruction against the civilians of another country, and that's the United States. Now, the propaganda was put out that by using the nuclear weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it forced Japan to surrender, and it actually meant there were fewer deaths than would have resulted from an invasion of the Japanese main islands. The reality is, Japan was already trying to surrender before the nuclear weapons were used. They knew they had lost. They were sending envoys to talk surrender, who were not being allowed in. And the reality is, the U.S. government dropped those nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to demonstrate to the rest of the world, first, that we had such weapons, and two, had the political will to use them on civilians. So I think before the United States starts pointing fingers at the risk of nuclear attack from other countries, they need to look in a mirror. And even North Korea is out there saying that the United States screaming about North Korea's nuclear development, or anybody else's, is a cover for the fact that the United States doesn't want to join a global disarmament. The U.S. wants every other country to give up their nuclear weapons, except the United States. But the nuclear weapons supposedly are a deterrent. As long as North Korea has nuclear weapons, it's going to make it very hard for anybody to successfully invade them. North Korea won't even have to use the nuclear weapons for that deterrent effect. If Iran gets a nuclear weapon, the same thing applies. They won't have to use the nuclear weapon. Its mere presence will discourage foreign invaders. It's exactly the same thing as having a gun in your house and everybody in the neighborhood knowing you have guns in your home. It discourages somebody from trying to break on in and steal what does not belong to them. I don't have a problem with North Korea having nuclear weapons. They're not going to initiate a first strike against anybody. Why give up that deterrent value? Because once you've used a nuclear weapon and no longer have it, there's nothing protecting you from a retaliatory strike. Just think these things through and you'll realize what a total load of bovine excrement all this nuclear North Korea stuff is. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. Hour number 2. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. Now, the U.S. is going to deploy F-35s to South Korea for joint drills. This is a show of force against North Korea, and I'm sure North Korea is realizing that the F-35 really isn't that much of a show of force. It's been declared by imperial fiat to be ready for combat, even as they admit major portions of the system still don't work. Helmet doesn't work, the internal cannon doesn't work. They've solved that by bolting an additional cannon to the belly, like they did to the F-4s in Vietnam. More weight, less maneuverability. It really is a real boondoggle, and nobody wants to admit it. Meanwhile, they're talking about saving money at the Pentagon by retiring the F-15s, which, yes, they're older aircraft and they've got their own series of problems, but they can at least out-dogfight an F-35. So they're putting these things out there to basically show, we have operational F-35s in Korea. They're taking a real risk. All it's going to take is a couple of crashes of that aircraft to really underscore the fact that it is not worth the money that's been poured into that thing. Now, here's a very interesting story. It's coming out of Italy. Apparently, Italian police arrested 3 Kosovo Muslim men and a child, for some reason, on suspicions of trying to blow up Venice's Rialto Bridge. If you know anything about Venice, Italy, the Rialto Bridge is an iconic image. It's this enclosed bridge, looks like an inverted V. It's over the Grand Canal. No, it's not the Grand Canal. It's one of the other large canals, but not the Grand Canal. And they're out there describing this as an ISIS-inspired plot. This is the new buzz phrase. We started seeing this following that terror attack in London at Parliament. They can't actually link any of these people to ISIS. They can't say, ISIS is behind this, because they've been exposed so many times for saying it's connected to ISIS. Oh, no, it was actually some other loser on prescription antidepressants. So now the new buzzword is ISIS-inspired. From now on, anything bad that happens, it was inspired by ISIS. Guy steals an ice cream cone. Oh, it was inspired by ISIS. Somebody beats their dog. Oh, they were inspired by ISIS. That's going to be the new buzzword, the new propaganda. They're ramping up ISIS as the boogeyman again ahead of a new false flag terror attack. And I love the way that Noam Chomsky was almost telegraphing this when he came on out and he said, Donald Trump is going to do a false flag attack. It's going to be Donald Trump when the false flag attack happens. Sure it is. Remember, Chomsky was out there on the forefront of saying, oh, absolutely, 9/11 was a real, genuine terror attack, and the U.S. and Israel had nothing to do with it. Now, there's been an interesting development. This is kind of a follow-on. Talk about carrying a grudge for a long time. A while back, during Holocaust Remembrance Day, Donald Trump got up there and he made a speech about remembering all the victims of Nazi Germany. And he did not specifically mention the magic words 6 million Jews, which prompted a huge outcry from Israel. And it was explained to Israel that Donald Trump wanted to commemorate all of the people who were victims of the Nazis, not just one group. And Israel got very upset about that. And so, interestingly enough, story that actually came out of the Times of Israel saying that this idea that there were millions of non-Jewish victims of those slave labor camps has no basis in fact. It's only contributing to Holocaust denial efforts to say that there were non-Jews who were in those camps. Of course there were non-Jews there. The Red Cross records show it. So Israel's attitude is nobody should question the story about 6 million Jews killed in the slave labor camps of Nazi Germany, but forget about all the other people who were in there as well. Forget about how the gays were sent to those same camps and how the gypsies were sent to those same camps and mentally retarded people were sent there. They don't want anybody diluting the sympathy game. Israel wants to own the history of World War II and milk it for their own benefit as hard as they can. All right, so let's talk about the economic news here. We have been seeing a lot of problems in the automobile industry. They're trying to keep the factories open, trying to keep the workers working, and these factories and dealerships are having to literally rent extra parking lots to park all the inventory. They can't sell it. And if you look at the car commercials right now, the prices are amazing. If anybody actually had money, this is a time to be buying the cars. Of course, if everybody had money, the prices would be higher. But apparently, the car crash, if you will, has reached used cars. And they're expecting that used car prices may fall as much as 50%. That'll be good news for Claire and I, because we're going to have to replace this Honda at some point real soon. But nobody has money. That's why we're still driving a 17-year-old Honda. We're going to do a quick shout-out to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining our network. Now, over in Iowa, some of the counties in Iowa have started wage hikes for the people living in their counties. But apparently, yesterday, Iowa Governor Terry Branstad signed House File 295, which prohibits any county or city in the state from exceeding the statewide minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, which is the same as the federal minimum wage, has not changed since the 2008 Wall Street meltdown. So the Iowa governor blocked minimum wage hikes approved in several counties. Now, here is the part that really bothers me. The reason our consumer economy is locking up, the reason the governments are going deeper and deeper into debt rapidly, is because ordinary people don't have any more money. High-paying jobs are being replaced by low-paying jobs. Some people are working 2 and 3 jobs just to get by. And somebody somewhere needs to wake up and realize that before you can expect ordinary Americans to buy what you are selling in the stores, to buy those manufactured cars, to buy big screen TVs, to buy new homes, they have to have money. They have to be able to trade their labor for decent wages and salaries. Before the American people can be expected to pay higher taxes, like carbon taxes, they have to have an economy that allows them to trade their labor for decent wages and salaries. Everybody who's trying to keep wages and salaries down are effectively slitting their own throat over the long term. And I find it amazing that nobody seems able to grasp this very simple concept. Somehow, money has to be recycled down from the top of that pyramid where it is intensely concentrated right now, and it has to be brought back down to the bottom as decent wages and salaries for the American people. Following the 2008 mortgage-backed security meltdown, everything the U.S. government did was absolutely the wrong thing for the economy as a whole. It was great for Wall Street and great for all those members of Congress whose stock portfolios include stock from those Wall Street firms. But it was bad for the nation. When that whole thing melted on down, if Congress, instead of taking trillions of dollars away from the American people and giving it to the bankers so the bankers could loan it back to the American people at interest, which they wound up not doing, they just wrote themselves huge bonuses with it all. If instead of doing that, they had gone to all the Wall Street firms and said, you're liquidated, you made this mess, we're going to take the money away from you and give it back to the people you defrauded, then people would have been able to stay up on their mortgage payments. There wouldn't have been a mortgage crisis. They would have been able to stay current on their credit card payments. There wouldn't have been a credit crisis. People would have been going on down to the car lots and buying new cars. There wouldn't have needed to be an automotive industry bailout. They would have gone on down to the shopping malls and bought products, hopefully made in America. There wouldn't have been a retail crisis. Everything that happened since 2008 is because Congress and Wall Street were working together to protect themselves and their wealth at the expense of everybody else, and that's a good illustration of why we are now living in a fascist economic dictatorship instead of a capitalist country. Now, over in India, they are starting to crack down on unofficial currencies. Bitcoin has now been outlawed, and anybody using Bitcoin could be considered to be a money launderer, according to India's central bank. The central banks don't want you using anything but their imaginary money, their ink and paper, their numbers in a computer. They can't stand the idea of competition. They have assassinated presidents to get rid of competition. I was just starting to get involved in one of the virtual currencies, Cloak Coin, I think it was. Just got outlawed here in Hawaii. They don't want competition. They don't want another form of medium of exchange that is not borrowed from them at interest. Don't want the slaves escaping. Don't want people coming up with their own money and their own currency. They want you dependent on that bank and having to borrow all currency at interest, which, by the way, was a primary cause of the American Revolution. You need to keep that in mind. Now, we've been talking about the CIA gun and drug running operations, Arkansas in the 1980s, heroin coming back from Vietnam, heroin coming back from Afghanistan today. Ron Paul has actually come on out and spoken on this, and he says, we know that the CIA is raising money in the drug industry when they want to run these secret wars. The American people need to wake up so this nonsense will stop. And yes, the American people need to wake up and realize that the biggest drug smuggler in the country is the country, and the war on drugs is really the war on the competition's drugs. Right now, the United States of America accounts for consumption of 80% of all the world's opium, between prescription opiates, which have become a huge problem, and the illegal opiates on the street, which have always been a problem, because it's highly addictive. We've become a very drugged-out society. We are the highest per capita users of legal drugs, prescription drugs. 1 out of every 4 Americans is on some form of prescription antidepressant. We know that those antidepressants lead to aberrant behavior in a significant portion of the patients. We're drugging ourselves into insanity and craziness. Domestic violence is up. Police brutality is up. Poor decision-making in Washington is up. It may be linked to the overuse of these mind-bending chemicals. But it's okay because a doctor wrote the note for it and a pharmacist sold it to you. So it must be okay, right? They would never sell anything harmful to you. I think it may be a bigger problem even than the vaccines. Now then, interesting little story over at Drexel University. Professor George Chicharilo Maher has been coming out with all these tweets and comments promoting violence and fatality toward white people, going all the way back to Christmas Eve. He tweeted, "All I want for Christmas is white genocide." And he's out there saying white is not really a race. And he still has his job. The university has said, well, yes, what he's saying is reprehensible, but we support the principle of the right to freedom of speech as long as you're not criticizing Israel. If you had a professor who was calling for genocide on the black people, or on Hispanics, or on Muslims, or on the Jews, what do you think the reaction would be? When did it become socially acceptable to discriminate against white people? And isn't discrimination and racism wrong, no matter what direction it's going in? You don't cure racism by being racist. You don't end discrimination by being discriminatory. And all too often, these so-called movements for equality turn out to be movements to basically reverse the prior situation. Women think they've been oppressed by men, now they want to oppress men. Blacks are angry over slavery, now they want to be the masters and have the whites be the slaves, even though nobody alive today was ever a slave, other than that 1040 form, and that affects us all. Nobody alive today is a slave owner, other than the private central bank. Maybe it's because of the prescription antidepressants, but it seems to me like our country has lost its common sense. We're caught up in all these fantasies about victimhood and rights to anything. The only rights you actually have are the ones acknowledged in the Bill of Rights. But people seem to want to justify personally beneficial behavior by saying they have a right. The illegal immigrants and the refugees, we have a right to come to your country. No, you don't. I have a right to take your children. I have a right to do it. No, you don't. The only rights you actually have in the United States of America are in the Bill of Rights. Those are your rights. You don't have a right to anything else. You don't have a right to other people's money. You don't have a right to silence other people and force your opinions on them. We need to return to common sense. Now, getting on to immigration proper, right now Britain is in the top 10 most dangerous countries in the world to live in, based on all the terrorist and refugee violence over the past 30 days. Huge volume of problems have been brought into Great Britain with all of these refugees coming on in. And it's made Britain hit that top 10 list of most dangerous countries to live in the world. They're still trying to keep a lid on all this in the corporate media. And they can't, because too many people have been affected. And they're going out on social media, and they're going to email and saying, we were just robbed by blah. We were just, my daughter was just gang raped by refugees. Marine Le Pen is basically declaring war on globalists. She's vowing to destroy the New World Order when she's elected president of France. And she's sending a warning to the European elite. She will dismantle the corrupt, self-serving institutions with her own two hands if she has to. And she's talking, of course, about the European Union Commission and the European Central Bank, both of which have been the cause of much pain, suffering, and misery for the European people. Now, the scientist who predicted Donald Trump's election victory, and was laughed at when he did that, Serge Galam, is saying that it looks to him like Marine Le Pen is very likely to win the French presidential vote. And like Donald Trump, she may have to overcome a huge amount of election fraud to do that. And he's basically saying that even though the polls are showing Marine Le Pen's lead over her rival is not all that great, the numbers he's looking at are seeing that the people who are not voting for Marine Le Pen are not likely to get out to the polls anyway. That they're saying they don't like Marine Le Pen, but they're probably going to stay home and not vote. But don't worry, I'm sure that somebody will cast a vote on their behalf. Because what we're hearing from the European Union is absolute fear and panic at the possibility of Marine Le Pen winning the election. And I'll tell you right now, there's going to be massive fraud in that election. We'll be right back. Hello, hi America. Welcome back to the show here. We're talking about Marine Le Pen, who is looking like she stands a reasonable chance of being the next president of France, and certainly in a world with honest elections, that would almost be a foregone conclusion. But she has tremendous forces arranged against her, and a good illustration of this is the story that's coming out of the Express in Great Britain. Marine Le Pen will kill off the European Union. Officials warn we can't survive a Frexit. And apparently up in Brussels they're saying basically if she wins the election, it's the beginning of the end of the European Union. And they're not going to let that happen. They've all gotten very rich and powerful off the EU scam, serving the globalist vision. And we've already seen evidence of massive election fraud against sovereignty, nationalist, populist candidates. The British police are now saying Nigel Farage lost his election due to massive election fraud. We saw massive election fraud in the first Scottish independence referendum. There was massive election fraud during the Brexit vote, but not enough to defeat it. Just like we saw massive election fraud in this country, but not enough to defeat Donald Trump. There are indications that Norway's recent election was rigged. There was that surprise come from behind victory for Angela Merkel in first round of their elections up there in Germany. Brussels is not going to let Marine Le Pen win if they can do anything about it. And that's why I am predicting we're going to see massive election fraud in France to try and keep her out. Because the globalists don't believe in democracy. They don't believe in will of the people. They believe in wealth and unlimited power for themselves, and anything that gets them that is perfectly okay. Now imagine a global government populated with people with that mindset, and you'll understand what's at risk. So if you are in France, or you know people in France, and they're supporting Marine Le Pen, you tell them they've got to get out and vote. A slim margin for Marine Le Pen will not be enough. She needs a landslide to overcome the election fraud. And I still think Donald Trump had a landslide result last year that's been concealed. Now, at the moment, there are more than 1 million migrants waiting to cross the Mediterranean into Europe. They're in the pipeline, so to speak, in Libya. And Joseph Walker Cousins, who's the former head of the British Embassy office in Benghazi, said that refugees are massing in the war-torn country, and criminal human trafficking gangs are just raking in billions of pounds, charging these migrants large sums to be smuggled across the Mediterranean in flimsy dinghies and boats. And yes, some of them are sinking and people are dying. Europe cannot absorb millions more migrants. They're already strained as it is. These migrants are a burden on their social systems. They're a burden on the indigenous taxpayers. Plus, there's the crime and disease problem as well. Now, up there in Sweden, which prides itself on having the first feminist government in history, and they've messed it up so bad, even Jeremy Clarkson was poking fun at them when Grand Tour did a show up there. And it's a liberal paradise there. They've got car-free zones and mandatory vaccines and all this other stuff up there. And, of course, being liberals, they believed in the open borders policy. And they worked to conceal the fact that it has brought with it a huge rape crisis. But the rape crisis in Sweden, brought in by the open borders policy, is now so bad, these Swedish feminists are out there screaming, we've got a rape crisis, we've got a rape crisis. And they're actually starting to leave the urban centers because of the high risk there. So the first feminist government, got to take a break for commercials, we'll be right back. And aloha America, welcome back to the show. We're talking about immigration, refugees, and so forth, and we were talking about this story where Sweden prides itself on having the world's first feminist government. And, of course, they've been going along with this liberal, globalist, open borders policy, and has led to Sweden being effectively the rape capital of the world. And so the first feminist government of the world opened the door to migrants, and now they're screaming they no longer feel safe. They're being assaulted and harassed and raped, and how could this possibly happen? And as will always be the case when it comes to liberals, they will never admit they made a mistake. It'll be somebody else's fault. Our policy is perfect. You messed it up. You did something wrong over here. Okay, let's see. We're going to take a phone call. John in Arizona, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, aloha, Mike. How you doing?
Doing fine.
Good to hear, man. Hey, I'm so sick of this. They're using all this depleted uranium on the Iraqis and the Yemenis. And, I'm being cornered to take all these drugs. My girlfriend's being cornered to take all these drugs. I mean, these chemical cartels are out of control.
Yeah, they are. They absolutely are. And it's almost like the illegal drug cartels have merged with the legal drug cartels, and now it's no longer enough to be selling addictive medications. Now they're just getting the government to say, you will buy our drugs, and you will give us your money. And it's huge amounts of money involved. I mean, the vaccine industry all by itself is $30 billion a year.
Yeah, I don't take any vaccines because, it's like I know they have, lead and mercury and formaldehyde and peanut oil and all that stuff in them. I'm just so sick of these chemical cartels running our lives,
one of the thinkings there, because we're still finding out what's actually in the vaccines, and some of it's very unpleasant. But the attitude is, if what we're selling you makes you sick, that's okay, because now you're going to buy something else from us to deal with the symptoms.
The drugs are forcing me and my girlfriend to increase the chance of diabetes and a stroke.
It is out of control. It is out of control, and I think in the blueprint for the new America, there has to be a basic recognized human right that you have a choice what goes in your body or does not go into your body, whether it's food or medication, that ultimately you have a right to say no about allowing known dangerous chemicals to be forced on you.
All right, well, thanks, Mike. You and Claire, keep up the good work.
Thank you very much. We're going to keep going as long as is necessary here. Now, Scotland has transmitted their formal request to the government of the United Kingdom for a new independence referendum. And at this point, the original motive for an independence referendum was Scotland wanted to remain part of the European Union. That may have changed with this massive oil and gas discovery off of Scotland's coast, which I'm sure Great Britain would still like to have their piece of, and so they'll oppose this independence referendum as strongly as they opposed the last one. But I'm pretty sure the people of Scotland are going to be watching the voting process a lot more closely than they did last time. So Scotland may just decide to be an independent nation again and just fund their country with the oil revenues and tourism. Now then, the Republican Party has decided they've come up with a way to fund Donald Trump's border wall and make Mexico pay for it indirectly. What they want to do is impose a 2% fee on all the money the illegal immigrants are sending home to Mexico. See, that's another cost of this open borders policy that nobody wants to talk about. The illegal immigrants will come up here. They're not paying taxes. They're being paid under the table. And they get food stamps and all this other stuff, and they send a lot of it back home to Mexico. They're bleeding our available wealth back to Mexico. Well, if that's going to happen, put a 2% fee on it, and there will be the money to build the wall. Personally, I don't think we need a wall on the border with Mexico. All we have to do is start enforcing the existing immigration laws. And if we take away the incentive for people to come to this country illegally, they will stop coming here. Cut them off from the food stamps, cut them off from welfare, cut them off from SNAP or whatever all these other programs are. Just say, if you come up here and you're not a citizen, you are going to starve to death. Start going after employers who employ these undocumented workers, or whatever the politically correct term for them is. Now, Texas Governor Greg Abbott has announced he will jail any sheriff who refuses to comply with Donald Trump's No Sanctuary Cities policy, And apparently they're putting some teeth into that because Austin, Texas has just been raided by Immigration Customs Enforcement. They've arrested at least 50 illegal immigrants. So it's starting. All right, we're going to grab ourselves a phone call. Sherry in Texas, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
I'm going to back. Hi, Mike. I'm going to back up a little bit. It's about the drug thing. I remember a while back, mainstream media was talking about how we've got to do something about mental health as a solution for gun violence. You know, we've got to understand mental health better. And I got to thinking, all that means is that more dangerous drugs will get out there and find new patients. If they're approaching it from a mental health standpoint, then more drugs are going to be there to treat the mental health patients, and that could make gun violence worse.
It will.
It
will. I mean,
yeah.
Look at all these mass shooters that the gun grabbers are wagging at us to attack the Second Amendment, and they're all either on or withdrawing from these dangerous prescription antidepressants. Obviously,
right.
Approaching gun violence from a mental health perspective is making matters worse, not better.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Step one is to ban the dangerous drugs like they do in Europe. Step two is to address the mental health and find a safe way to treat the anxiety and depression. And then step three is to see where we stand on the gun issue clearly and really attack it without this other stuff in the way, because we'll never get around to understanding how to balance and have the right gun laws until we get the drugs and the mental health issue out of the way.
Well, I mean, most of the anxiety and depression and repressed rage in the American people is coming from the abuse of government and bankers. If they were to back off, we'd all calm down and be absolutely zen-like calm and tranquil and peaceful. But what we have is a government which is following the model that Aldous Huxley put out in Brave New World, a government that oppresses its people and enslaves them and then drugs them so that they don't react with anger to how they're being treated. And that's exactly that. We are already in a country where they're ordering us to take vaccines. It's a small step to ordering us to take psychiatric medication. And by the way, remember water fluoridation? And we were all told it was going to help us fight tooth decay. Drinking fluoride has no effect on tooth decay whatsoever, but it is a mild tranquilizer.
Oh, heck. I didn't know that.
Yes.
That's interesting. Well, thank you, Mike.
All right, thank you. And I agree with you on the gun rights issue. Obviously, there are some people who should not be allowed to have guns. But I don't think banning all guns and traumatizing children to be afraid of guns is going to be the solution. And again, I came out of a very, very different world where we were taught gun safety, and guns were not mysterious objects. The more you remove them, the more people are going to be fascinated with them because they're seeing them in movies and TV shows, and they think that's what guns are all about. And if they're taught the proper way of safely handling the gun and target shooting and hunting for food, you're going to see those problems go away. We had an open gun culture in the town I grew up in. Everybody had a gun. We took them to school, put them in the cloakroom, chased critters out of the farm fields on the way home. We never had mass shootings or anything like that. It just didn't happen. Anyway, listen, Sherry, going to let you go. I'm going to take another call here. Gaither in Oklahoma, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, it's Gaither in Oklahoma.
Gaither, I'm sorry. Sorry.
I went down. It's all right. I went down to the hospital to drop off just some clothes for my daughter-in-law, and there was no place to park, so I parked by the helipad, and I didn't know what to do, and it was a bad parking spot, so I just reached the glove box. There was an old script in it for my wife, some bolstering or something, so I put it underneath the windshield wiper blade, and I ran in the hospital. I come out, and a security guard standing by my car looking at the prescription. I go, well, every time I park here, they give me another prescription. He just looked at me, and I got in the car, drove off. And it was pretty funny.
That is funny.
It blew his mind. It was like, wow.
That is funny.
Anyway, it's a funny story. All right, thanks, Mike. Just something to laugh at.
All right, well, thank you very much, and that's definitely a good way to get out of trouble. Last time I got pulled over by a traffic cop, and he come up and said, do you know why I pulled you over? And I look at him and I say, because I'm black? You see a black man driving a fine, expensive car like this, and you just assume something has to be wrong, and that's profiling. And he started laughing, and he waved me off. Anyway, getting on back to more serious things here. Another WikiLeaks dump out there. This one is revealing another program by the CIA. It's called Marble. And apparently Marble is another program in which the CIA disguises their hacking tools as Russian, Chinese, even Arabic. And so from this point forward, you cannot trust anybody in the media who says we know that Russia or China or Iran has hacked into these computers, because, hey, it could very easily be the CIA pretending to be them, to try and build a case to lead to war. I'm not buying this idea that North Korea is hacking our computers. That's probably another one of these CIA programs. All right, we're going to take another phone call. Rick in Nevada, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike, this sending of the feds into Austin to deal with the sheriff there for providing sanctuary to refugee or illegal aliens, that's a bad precedent, and it could lead to a constitutional crisis if the people of Texas have the backbone to stand up to the feds.
Well, wait a minute. I'm sorry, but the sheriff is in violation of Title VIII. And the state's governor is saying he should go to jail. And
let the people of Texas deal with it, though, not the feds. You know.
Well, the governor of the state says, yeah, he's going to throw him in jail.
Well,
okay.
If it's the governor of Texas acting on his own, great. But I don't want to see this precedent of.
Well, if you have the state authorities refusing to enforce the law, then obviously the federal government does have to step on in. We're going to let you go here and get on back because I'm running out of time. We're coming up on the top of the hour and our clarification here. Now, apparently, if you are a software developer, user, open source kind of fan here, and for those of you on BAM User, I've got my little Pi set up here with a workstation. I'm having a lot of fun with that thing. Apparently, GitHub has been targeted by hackers, and it goes back to January. It's a very sophisticated piece of malware called Dimny, and it's got modules that do all kinds of different things. In fact, it's being described as a cyber weapon. It doesn't look like something that was written by an individual. It looks like something that was developed by an organized programming team, and it's very hard to find, very hard to remove, and it's been infecting developers who are putting their software up on GitHub. Now, stop for a moment and think, who is it who hates the open source movement? Well, obviously, corporations that want you to buy their software and use it, and obviously the NSA and the CIA, who understand that if you are using open source software that you compile yourself, that you can make sure that it doesn't have their little back doors in there. And so I'm not at all surprised that a very sophisticated cyber weapon, which, by the way, was being used against the Russians first, is being used against the open source movement. Now then, tomorrow's April Fool's Day, as I mentioned before, but no fooling and no joke, New England is getting snow. They're getting a big storm coming on in. It's going to bring snow to Maine, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire starting later today and continuing through tomorrow. And they're already concerned about widespread power outages because it's a heavy, wet snow. Over in Wyoming, crews are trying to dismantle this 55-foot pound of ice that glaciated out of the snow, built up over the winter, refuses to budge. They may have to take explosives to that. Southern Norway saw a 20-degree temperature drop in just 2 days. Normally, March is supposed to come in like a lion and go out like a lamb. This year it's reversed. It came in like a lamb and it's going out like a lion. And still they're pushing human-caused global warming. One of the reasons they may be doing it is Al Gore is about to debut his sequel to his mockumentary, An Inconvenient Truth, which has been completely discredited. So Raising on a Busted Flesh, he's coming out with an inconvenient sequel, and they're trying to promote it and get people to see it. I think it's going to be an absolute disaster because we've had it with all this global warming nonsense. Story coming out of the Daily Mail. Climate change takes a toll on mental health and will lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's not what you experienced in the war zones that's messed up your head. It's just global warming here. Al Gore is now out there saying that global warming was the principal cause of the Syrian war, redefining the phrase out of touch, because the principal cause of the Syrian war is the U.S. wishing to replace Bashar al-Assad. But Al Gore's out there hawking his new sequel, and I don't expect anybody's going to pay attention this time. Apparently, something that is not being reported in the corporate media, shale oil production is suffering a massive decline at the moment. In other words, the fracking industry is not producing the payoff that was promised for all the leaking methane and toxic fracking fluid and all the other problems that they've created. It's just not there. And talk about a failed policy and a failed plan. They never got the volume of gas and oil out of the fracking wells that they thought they were going to. And apparently the rates of return are even dropping even more. And it's causing earthquakes all over the fracking states, especially Oklahoma. The quake that cracked the Washington Monument was thought to be caused by fracking. Badly thought out policy. Got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha America, welcome back to our show here. And apparently the CDC has now come out with a document that is revealing more about what's inside vaccine excipients, is the word they like to use, including African green monkey kidney cells and fibroblast cells from aborted human fetuses. Ooh, yummy. I just can't wait to have that in my arm here. Now, speaking of the antidepressants, story coming out of Natural News, apparently there was a really bad reaction to an antidepressant drug. This woman was on them, and she suffered hallucinations in which she thought she had killed her own children. It's amazing. Now, we were talking about the drugging of America, opiates, prescription antidepressants, along with all of this feminization issues and confusion and transgenderism. And I was wondering how much of this is really from birth, how much of it is socialized behavior, you should want to be a woman or whatever, and there may be a chemical component. And there's an article that came out of Green Med Info talking about the toxic chemicals that turn boys into girls. Because there's a lot of chemicals out there that start messing with the basic chemistry of your body. And a lot of that is tied in with your gender. This has to be looked at. This has to be looked at. If this onslaught of these hormone-disrupting chemicals and psychiatric medications, is it turning us into something else? We're going to take a phone call. Boise from Michigan. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. How you doing today?
I'm doing fine. What's on your mind?
Great. And what's on my mind is, let's say day one, they shoot, North Korea shoots a missile over to the United States, and the bomb blows up. What happens on day two?
North Korea disappears.
I'm sorry?
Day two, North Korea disappears.
Exactly. So why, we've got submarines and that can blow missiles off 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I just don't know where all the fear's coming from here. I just don't understand, this big fear-monger thing.
That you hit it right the second time. It isn't fear, it's fear-mongering. And what you need to remember is my parents' generation forked over $5 trillion, and back then $1 trillion was really a lot of money, to build America's nuclear deterrent. All the missile-carrying submarines, the bombers, the silos all over the Midwest, with the idea that nobody dared attack us. Okay? Now, if that deterrent worked, if it was worth the $5 trillion, then we have nothing to fear from North Korea or Iran or Iraq or anybody else. If it didn't work, then we got scammed again, and we are owed a refund for all that money that went into those holes in the ground. Anyway, boys... I got to let you go. We got to take station break. We're going to close the phone lines for the lovely Lady Claire. And apologies to those who were waiting and didn't get on. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here, hour number 3. We're going to close the phone lines for a little bit here and talk to the lovely Lady Claire. And Claire, what's the first thing you want to talk about?
Well, the first thing I want to talk about is something which, of course, is not being covered at all on the prostitute media, shall we just call it what it is. And apparently, Italy is having this humongous banking crisis. And this is why it's gone off the radar. It's almost so serious that the worse it gets, the less we hear about it. And investors and voters might get spooked, and Italian elections are coming up very quickly. But there was a very interesting article through Zero Hedge that was published in the financial section of the Italian daily Il Sole, and it talks about how serious the situation has become. According to new research by Italian investment bank Mediobanca, 114 of the close to 500 banks in Italy have what are called Texas ratios of over 100%. Now, this ratio is calculated by dividing the total value of a bank's non-performing loans by its tangible book value plus reserves, or as American money manager Steve Eisman put, all the bad stuff divided by the money you have to pay for all the bad stuff. And this is really nasty because the only question that comes to mind is if there's a default on these banks, Mike, will the EU and IMF be able to bail Italy out without invoking the extreme financial austerity on the English people, as happened when the Cyprus banking system fell apart, and also Greece?
Yeah, Greece. Greece. The demands made by the ECB on Greece are simply unattainable.
Yeah.
But the attitude of these money junkies is, we don't care. Work your people to death, give us all the money, and even then we won't be happy.
Yeah, you know, it seems to be reaching this critical point of not being able to be saved. You know.
Okay.
And one has to wonder who's going to, if it's going to be Iexit or Frexit next.
Well, if looking at the massive amounts of election fraud that we're already seeing in the European elections, the EU is going to fight this tooth and nail. We could even see the EU literally launch a war to reconquer these departing provinces. And they would probably cite the American Civil War as their historical justification.
Whoa.
But again, under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all of these EU member states do have a right to self-determination.
Yeah. It's insane. There was a very interesting observation with NBC about Obamagate and Trumpgate, Russiagate, and apparently confirming the incriminating remarks from former Obama Deputy Secretary of Defense, Evelyn Farkas, on the mad scramble by the Obama administration to collect and preserve intelligence on alleged Russian election hacking before Obama left office. NBC is reporting that a former Obama official admits they made a list of Russian probe documents to keep them safe. And, Mike, all I can think, it appears toward the end that the DNC knew that they had their bet on the losing horse, and at the end of the day had to find someone to blame it on.
Well, I'm sure that's a side effect here, but, you know, we're now getting indications that the spying on Trump went back to before he'd even won the nomination.
Yeah.
And so we're back in Watergate territory. Obama was using the security apparatus of the United States of America to spy on the Trump campaign and was apparently sharing the information all over the place with any Democrat who was interested, or even the never-Trump Republicans were getting this material. And it's not Watergate 2. It's actually worse than Watergate. And I imagine somewhere Richard Nixon is kicking back and smiling that he's no longer going to be seen as the absolute most corrupt president in American history.
Yeah.
Let me make one thing perfectly clear. I accept the responsibility, but not the blame.
Another thing that we need to take a look at and be aware of, apparently Venezuelan bonds have crashed as the political situation in that country has turned explosive. The bonds crashed today as a result of political tensions after the annulment of the country's legislation legislature by its high court on Wednesday, a move that ignited, tons of protests, invoked international condemnation, and prompted opposition to call for a military response to what seemed to be a coup by Maduro. And he is apparently attempting to seize unilateral control of the government and isolate the opposition. This could get nasty very, very quickly.
Well, that opposition, of course, is U.S.-backed and U.S.-funded, and the U.S. has been waging covert war, an economic war against Venezuela going all the way back to Hugo Chavez, because Venezuela dares to spend the taxpayers' money on the taxpayers and sells their oil for whatever currencies they want. And that sets a bad example for the rest of the world. We only tolerate governments that grind their people into the dirt and give the money to the bankers.
Yeah, yeah.
We're going to do a quick shout-out now to our on-air affiliates who are just rejoining our network. We're talking with the lovely Lady Claire for our weekly clarification, and we're talking about North Korea.
And in Europe, SecDef Mattis said North Korea has got to be stopped. And he made the observation, right now, North Korea appears to be going in a very reckless direction, and that has got to be stopped. Now, he didn't give any details about how the United States is going to do this. And
well, he didn't give any details about what North Korea is doing. And I love the way that he says that North Korea is thumbing their nose at the international community. And again, it shows that Matisse is on board with the globalists here. Now, again, as we had a caller in the last hour, it made it very clear. North Korea's desire for nuclear weapons is as a deterrent. When the United States was spending huge amounts of taxpayer money building our nuclear arsenal, it was always said, so nobody will feel that they can attack us with impunity. And the same thing is true for North Korea, or for that matter, Iraq. If they'd had nuclear weapons, or Iran, if they get nuclear weapons, they're not going to launch a first strike, because the result would be national suicide. The reason to have nuclear weapons is to discourage other countries from invading you by saying it'll be more costly than it's worth to steal our country from us. And again, in all of history, the only nation to ever actually use nuclear weapons of mass destruction against civilians of another country is the United States. And so they really do not have standing to be screaming about other countries' nuclear weapons and what they may do with it.
And as you mentioned, there's going to be a meeting between President Xi Jinping of China and President Trump in Florida next week. And SecDef Mathis, a word, please. I would like very much to see you talk with your Chinese counterpart about getting North Korea back to the negotiating table along with South Korea and Japan to hammer out a peace treaty to replace the existing armistice, with the proviso that in order for that to happen, North Korea has got to abandon its nuclear weapons program.
I think North Korea would probably go along with that because the only North Korea doesn't really have the money to be developing nuclear weapons.
No.
They're only doing it because they're constantly seeing all this threat of invasion from the south, invasion from the ocean, invasion from the north. If you take away this threat that they're going to be invaded, they're going to stop focusing on building what are essentially deterrent weapons. And that's what they are. And again, North Korea is not going to attack anybody with a nuclear weapon because the result would be instant annihilation. And so I don't have a problem with North Korea having nuclear weapons. I don't have a problem with Iraq having had nuclear weapons, if they ever haven't, and it doesn't look like they did. Or Iran getting nuclear weapons. It's actually going to calm things down. That was the excuse when the nuclear club was basically the U.S. and Russia. It was called mutually assured destruction, and we were told this is what kept the world from going into a new world war. Then, of course, Israel stole a bunch of weapons-grade uranium from the United States, started making bombs, started selling them to other countries like South Africa, and for all we know, North Korea is actually getting their nuclear weapons from Israel. We have no way of knowing that's not happening. In fact, one of the clues that we need to look at is when North Korea had their first nuclear weapons test, there was a surveillance aircraft overhead that grabbed samples of the radioactive fallout, and they found it to be an isotopic match with what was called the Vela incident in the South Atlantic, which was thought to be a joint Israel-South African nuclear test. So there are reasons to say that Israel may have sold nuclear weapons to other countries besides South Africa. And actually the South African deal did not go through that anybody is aware of. Or if it did, nobody knows where those nuclear weapons are now.
Oh, that's a little troubling.
Yes.
It's like...
Well,
yeah.
you know, one of the big problems coming out of the Bush administration, remember that big stink about Valerie Plame?
Yes.
And they outed her as a CIA agent
yeah.
to discredit her husband, who was out there saying that there's no truth to this Iraq buying yellow cake from Niger, and in the process destroyed Valerie's CIA career and the company she was working for, which was actually the CIA's facility for tracking nuclear weapons in the third world. And they lost all their contacts, all their support, and literally blinded the United States intelligence community from knowing who does and does not have nuclear weapons. It was a reckless, reckless thing to do.
Very much so. I'd like to go on over to Yemen. And it appears that the United States government and military is going to escalate its 2 years war on starving Yemen.
Well, we'll teach those people of Yemen to kick out our imposed puppet ruler. What's wrong with those people? Once you're conquered, you stay conquered.
And the irony of this is a couple of days after the invasion was started into Yemen 2 years ago, General Lloyd Austin, commander of the U.S. CENTCOM, was asked about the objectives of the U.S. support. And his stunning reply remains the most accurate characterization from a U.S. official. I don't currently know the specific goals and objectives of the Saudi campaign, and I would have to know that to be able to assess the likelihood of success. Other than dropping weapons with an unconscionable lack of discrimination and proportionality, it appears that the goals are no more clear to this day.
Well, that's because they can't admit what the goals really are.
Yeah.
And the U.S. had the same problem in Iraq, where Iraq was sold to the American people about, we've got to get their weapons of mass destruction. They assisted in 9/11. They're aiding al-Qaeda, all of which turned out to be complete lies. And because they were complete lies, there could never be a perception of U.S. victory in Iraq, because Iraq didn't have nuclear weapons. They were actually ideological enemies with al-Qaeda. And even George Bush later admitted on video, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. And so what we have here is a war to reimpose a puppet ruler on Yemen, but that doesn't sound really good to the American people who are being asked to spend their tax money on these wars
and sacrifice their kids
and send their children to be killed and crippled in these wars. And they don't actually have a propaganda cover. They don't have a masquerova on this one. So that's why he's saying, I don't have a clue what we're doing here, but we're making a heck of a lot of progress.
And I must tell you, and I've got to tell our readers and our listeners, I am profoundly morally uncomfortable that my country, the United States of America, has chosen to be actively complicit in Saudi Arabia's war crimes in Yemen. And make no mistake, folks, these are war crimes of the highest magnitude. The Saudi military is routinely assassinating and maiming Yemeni children with their bombing runs. The Saudi blockade of Yemeni ports has left Yemeni children starving to death of malnutrition. And due to the massive growth of stillbirths, infant deformities, and cancers in Yemen, it's a pretty darn safe conclusion to draw that the Saudis are using depleted uranium weapons here.
And those are terrible. The gift that keeps on giving, the half-life of depleted uranium is 4.5 billion years. And the U.S. is apparently trying to solve part of its radioactive waste problem by turning them into weapons and making it somebody else's radioactive waste problem. And, of course, the problem is the depleted uranium in the weapon, it's a big solid chunk. You can pick it up and throw it in a burial site easily. But once the weapons are actually employed, they vaporize on impact, and it creates this cloud of ultrafine depleted uranium particles that mix in with the soil, and when the wind blows, you breathe them in, and you cannot get rid of them. It's in the food, you eat it, and every place depleted uranium weapons are used, we see this result of massive birth defects following. It's happened in Iraq. It's happening among our veterans returning from the war zones, people who've been exposed to these weapons. I knew somebody who had been a weapons loader for the A-10 attack plane, which uses depleted uranium shells, and he had come on back, and he was a fellow Amiga developer, and he came down with cancer and died. So it is horrific, and we're going to try and raise a little more public awareness about what these depleted uranium weapons are doing. Because, I mean, do we not have enough problems with the radiation pouring out of Fukushima and Hanford and Whips and Turkey Point now, 3 Mile Island, all these other places? We're making the problem worse by shoving this stuff all over the planet.
And I've got to tell you, and I've got to tell our readers and listeners, this is one of the most horrific forms of child abuse I can think of. Deforming and poisoning children in the womb through exposure to these weapons, and yet, apparently the Royal House of Saud, the Saudi government, and the U.S. government are perfectly comfortable destroying not only the lives of these children, but the lives of the families as well, because there is no remedy.
No, there isn't. It's a one-way trip. It's a one-way trip. And once the damage is done, there's currently no way to undo it. But remember, according to the corporate media, you should not feel bad about all these deformed children and all these war zones, but please feel really sorry for the victims of the terror attack in London. That's who you should be crying about. But pay no attention to all these other civilian casualties and deformed babies. And we're not buying it. We're offended by this action. It is a war crime. By any reasonable definition, depleted uranium ought to be considered a weapon of mass destruction. Again, because when it's employed, it vaporizes and it spreads and it blows before the wind, and it does basically contaminate everything downwind of the intended target. That's a weapon of mass destruction right there.
And I am profoundly reminded in this obscenely callous disregard for human life, as reflected in these Saudi military tactics, of the comments made by the papal legate at the siege of Montségur against the Cathars. When the guy was informed that not only men were in the besieged castle, but women and children were also there, he said, "Kill them all. God will find his own."
And they made him a saint for that, St. Dominic.
Oh, boy. And they're talking about U.S. boots on the ground in Yemen and more airstrikes. And the sense I get is that this is going to happen sooner rather than later, unfortunately.
Well, they may just decide to just scrape the place out, and Saudi Arabia will annex it. And meanwhile, of course, the U.S. is building that massive new naval base on that island to basically project power over the entrance to the Gulf. And that nobody's talking about that either.
Socotra, right? Socotra Island?
Socotra Island. And don't bother looking at it in Google Earth, because Google Earth has locked a photo from back in 2004 so that you don't see what's going on over there.
You know, better if you could use a search engine in something like Press TV or Russia Today or Fars News.
I can't imagine that anybody not connected with building the nuclear base is even allowed on the island or over the island at this point. It's apparently was supposed to be a secret. So don't tell anybody, okay, that we told you. Okay? And it's a secret.
Yeah, right. And they're bringing in a ton of foreign workers. Apparently no American workers are allowed out there. It's all foreign workers.
Well, I'll bet the Bin Laden family's getting a huge piece of this action.
Oh, probably. Probably.
The Bin Laden family is good buddies with the Bush family. That's why they get all these war zone construction contracts from the U.S. government. Anyway, we've got about a minute and a half before the break. What's next?
This comes out of Global Research and is an article by Stephen Lendman, a gentleman to whom I link frequently, because now Stephen and we have an agreement to disagree on some areas, but he is very powerfully clear and intelligent. Apparently, Russia is now fearful of a U.S. preemptive nuclear attack. And according to Russia's General Staff Deputy Head of Operations, General Viktor Poznikir, the presence of American ABM sites in Europe and ABM-capable ships in the seas and oceans close to Russia's territory creates a powerful clandestine potential for delivering a surprise nuclear missile strike against Russia.
Oh, and small point, all these ABM sites and ABM-capable ships are a violation of the ABM Treaty. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And Claire, what's your next story?
Well, apparently there was an anniversary of sorts of the EU in Rome, which was on lockdown for it. At the event, the communique that was adopted was basically the EU's response to Brexit. The EU is trying to survive as a coalition of nationalistic regimes held together by aspirations to become an aggressive military bloc rivaling the United States.
Now, that's not the majority opinion of the member states of the EU. That's coming out of Brussels.
Right.
And Britain. And to a lesser extent France and definitely Germany. But the rest of those countries, they don't want to be a military bloc. They don't want any more war in their front yard.
Yeah. They have a very clear memory of what war feels like, and they don't want to have to deal with it again. And my observation is, Mike, under its current situation, it's unsustainable at any speed. And both Greece and Italy are falling apart so quickly economically as to give one whiplash in watching these economies plunge.
Absolutely. And have you noticed how Cyprus is no longer in the news? They don't want you to know how bad things are over there.
And how bad are they?
They're so bad.
Yeah.
But again, the European Union was created with a built-in self-destruct device called the European Central Bank, another privately owned bank that is allowed to create money out of thin air and loan it into circulation at interest, and it's naturally unstable. You cannot keep it operating over time. It's plunged Europe into hopeless debt, much as the Bank of England plunged the American colonies into debt, because that's what they do. Private central banks are all about enslaving the people with debt, looting their wealth, putting it in the pockets of the bankers. They've been doing it here in the United States for 100 years. They've been doing it in Europe for however long the EU's been around, and everybody's fed up with this because inevitably this practice leads to a war. When governments are so far in debt, they look to loot other people's wealth to pay off their debts, and the banks will actually try and cause wars, because wars will cause countries to borrow even more. There was a movie that came out a while back called The International, and it was based on the world of banking. The storyline was basically that this bank, and it was sort of loosely based on BCCI, was getting involved in small arms manufacturing, and somebody was asking this banking executive why a bank would want to get involved in controlling a conflict. And he says, no, it's not about controlling the conflict. It's about controlling the debt a conflict creates, because that is the thing of value in a war, the debt that it creates that is owned by the bank. And that, here we are again. Countries have finished paying off their debts from World War I and World War II, so of course we're going to start World War III and start the whole scam all over again.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is a vicious cycle, and basically it's a giant grinding machine that your children are dropped into the top, and the grinders are turned, and out of the bottom comes money that goes into the bankers' pockets.
Yeah. I'd sort of like to bop on over to Israel right now, and apparently in Israel there will be no early elections. Apparently Netanyahu managed to strong-arm his finance minister and kill a new news broadcast. And he finally reached a deal yesterday with Finance Minister Moshe Kalon that puts an end to a political crisis that threatened to see the government dissolved over a new public broadcaster, senior sources say. According to the deal, the broadcaster's news division will now be dismantled. And earlier this month, the Prime Minister announced he was thinking about a compromise to allow Khan, the new public broadcaster, to launch, but only following enactment of new legislation giving the government more influence over the news authorities.
So you can have a public broadcaster as long as we, the government, tell you what to broadcast. Gee, that sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is really the fact that the Israeli people don't have a pretty more immediate choice on its leadership is a real tragedy. Because in my view, Netanyahu is going to take Israel to war, and possibly to war that it cannot be successful in.
Well, Israel has an escape hatch. They start a war with somebody like Russia, then they stand off to one side and let America come in and finish it up. We've got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And what is your next story, Claire?
Well, a gentleman by the name of Yuval Steinitz, who is Israel's National Infrastructure, Energy, and Water Minister, gave a very interesting interview to the Jerusalem Post, in which he claimed that Iran's traction in Syria is a greater threat to Israel than is ISIS. And he made the statement, it's very easy and convenient to focus on ISIS, he told the Jerusalem Post. But we have two challenges in Syria. One is ISIS, the other is Iran. And the greater threat is coming from Iran, and not just from its nuclear program.
Okay, I'm going to insert right here.
Yes.
I mean, we're seeing the repeat of this same propaganda tactic that we're seeing here in the U.S.
Yeah.
Even though the story is completely baseless.
Yeah, fact-free.
Iran's nuclear weapons or Russia's Trump connection, they just keep on saying it like it's an established fact. Russia stole Crimea. No, they didn't. Trump and Russia are working together behind the scenes. No, they're not. Iran is building a nuclear bomb. No, they're not. Iran is fully in compliance with that P5+1 agreement. They allow IAEA inspections. They've signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Which Israel has not.
Israel has not, and Israel will not allow IAEA inspections. And still it's Israel out there saying Iran's the nuclear threat, Iran's the nuclear threat. Do a quick tally. Look at how many countries Iran has invaded and attacked over the last, say, a quarter of a century versus how many countries Israel has attacked over the last quarter century versus how many countries the U.S. has attacked over the last quarter of a century. And you'll realize that whatever the problem is with war and strife, it's not Iran. I mean, these days, Israel can't seem to go 6 months without bombing or killing somebody, usually Gaza.
Yeah.
And it is nonsense. And we're literally living in that post-truth world. You know, the facts and the truth don't matter. Just what I can convince you is real, that's what's important. Yeah. It's a world of illusion and perception. It's like everybody in government used to be a nightclub magician, and they're getting by with cards up the sleeves and whatever they can fool you into thinking. And not realizing that most people these days are going on out and finding the truth for themselves. Iran is not a threat to world peace. It's not a threat to Israel. The reverse is true. Israel has made no secret of the fact they want Iran destroyed.
Yeah.
John McCain, who's very good buddy with Israel, wants Iran destroyed. All of these people want Iran destroyed. Iran is not returning the favor. By the way, there's a great video.
Thank you.
That you should hunt down on YouTube. Please don't tell my mother I'm in Iran. And it's actually a documentary made by a Jewish individual who actually went to Iran to find out if it was really the den of iniquities that the media says it is. And what he found is a bunch of people just living their lives, worshiping as they choose, doing business, taking care of their families, just like you and I, ordinary people. And again, it's like this EU Parliament went on down to Syria and discovered that what's going on in Syria is completely different from what the corporate media is putting on out.
Absolutely.
And again, the war hawks, we can tell who's initiating all this war. It's not Iran. Yeah. It's the U.S. and Israel that are, leading the world into a new nuclear world war. And I'll tell you right now, if Israel could find some way to trick the U.S. and Russia into a mutually destructive nuclear war, Israel would come out on top. With their nuclear arsenal, they would control the Middle East, and through the Middle East oil, they would control the world. And you'd better understand that inside Israel's government, they're seriously talking about that as a possibility.
Yeah. And the other thing I notice with the Israeli government, they're constantly trying to put their people, the Israeli people, in a constant state of fear.
Oh, absolutely. If the Israeli people ever calmed down and started thinking, the current government of Israel would be in serious trouble. The same thing is here in the United States. That's why they're ramping up the ISIS booga booga again. Yeah. They need to keep you afraid of ISIS, keep you afraid of Russia, keep you afraid of the abominable snowman, whatever. But as long as you're afraid, you are emotionally, psychologically dependent on them, and they maintain control.
I remember a statement on this that Marie Curie, the co-discoverer of radium, stated.
Yes.
She said, "Nothing is to be feared. Everything is to be understood." And when you understand the facts and you pull back a little bit and you see what's going on, the state of fear in which the U.S. government is trying to enmesh their own people is a psychological tool.
again, going back to the Cold War of the 1950s and 1960s. It was constant. It was in the schools. Russia's going to come and get you. The commies are coming to indoctrinate you. The commies have got nuclear. They're going to do this. They're going to do it. It was a constant drumbeat of fear. Be afraid of these people and obey us, and you will be safe. And now they're trying to do it all over again. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
Absolutely.
So there, George W.
I'd like to go over to Bahrain, which is the home of the U.S. 5th Naval Fleet. Apparently on Wednesday, Secretary of State Tillerson lifted the government's human rights restrictions on arms sales to Bahrain in a move that Amnesty International called galling and a dangerous signal. The State Department notified Congress of its intent to proceed with the sale of F-16 fighters and other weapons to the Gulf Kingdom without the human rights conditions.
Which is kind of hypocritical looking at the United States anyway, which is violating human rights around the world between drone strikes and torture, and it really is a ridiculous situation here. And I wish the United States government had the courage to stand up and say, yeah, we admit it, we're dictators, we're tyranny, we're committing war crimes around the world. And just get used to it. And again, the U.S. will use human rights violations as an excuse to invade other countries and change their government. But if a government of a country that is actually committing human rights violations is friendly to the United States, then no big deal. And here, have some F-16s.
President Trump's administration is beginning to rapidly disappoint me.
I agree.
And right now, looking at this dropping the human rights thing in Bahrain, Trump is well on his way to becoming the AFAB president. Anything for a buck for his defense corporate buddies.
Okay, now, I want to step in here a little bit because what we're seeing, we're hearing about this stuff. It's coming out of the State Department. It's coming out of here, coming out of there.
Yeah.
I think we need to hold open the possibility that Trump is right now overwhelmed with all this Russia nonsense, this Obamagate nonsense, and many of these decisions are actually being made by subordinates that he may not be wholly on board with. We had somebody who called into the show the other day and said much of this warmongering against Russia appears to be originating within NATO rather than the U.S.
Okay.
I would like Donald Trump to put his foot down and actually show us what his real policy is going to be on this, because he did campaign on no more of these foreign U.S. interventions.
Yep.
And if, in fact, Donald Trump is approving these escalations in Syria and selling of the weapons of Bahrain, then clearly this is a campaign promise that he has broken. And, yes, I, too, am very disappointed in him as well. I still maintain that Donald Trump at his worst is still better than Hillary Clinton at her best.
Yes, I would tend to agree. But unfortunately, the sale is a message calculated to give any despot on this planet who are massively suppressing their own people a moment of pure and outright joy.
As long as they're aligned with the U.S.
of course.
policy.
Of course,
if you're despot oppressing your people and you're not doing business with the U.S., then we're coming to get you.
Yeah. There was an article I read in What Does It Mean about Russia, and apparently Putin is ordering to draft over 140,000 men into the army this spring. Now, this would not be so worrying because Russia does conscript. However, when it is combined with the following article, again from TASS.com, and I encourage people to read the English language version of this because they're very clear, the conclusions are worrisome in the extreme. Putin has now beefed up the number of his troops in the military to nearly 2 million.
Well,
That's
wouldn't you?
I
mean,
guys.
Let's look at it from Putin's point of view.
Oh, yeah.
He's hearing all this Russia bashing coming from the U.S. government. He's seeing all these American war hawks like John McCain openly talking about war with Russia, war with Russia.
Yeah.
He's seeing this massive buildup of troops and machinery along the border with Russia. From Putin's point of view, it looks like the NATO is getting ready to invade Russia.
Well, that was my observation with this added troop strength. It appears that Putin, and you and I know he's a great chess player. I bet you'd love to play against him just to see what he could do.
I don't need to be that humiliated. I quit playing chess when my iPhone kept whipping me because I won't accept such upstart behavior from appliances.
But it appears that he's hedging his bets on some kind of a false flag to be blamed on Russia where NATO just goes in, because NATO it's been like Pac-Man. It's been absorbing these Eastern European countries and placing troops and materials.
They're building a front to go into Russia, and I'm sure that Putin remembers very clearly how close the Nazis got to Moscow, and he's got no intention of letting that happen again. I don't blame Putin one tiny bit.
Nor do I.
He's being very cautious and very prudent in the face of all of this warmongering by the U.S. and by NATO. He has to understand that he's been an enemy of the West ever since he took direct control of Russia's central bank to run the Russian public currency as a public utility. And by the way, he has doubled Russia's gross domestic product by taking control of the currency. And that, too, is making him an enemy of everyone in the West because, again, if Putin takes control of the central bank and Russia's economy is improving, then everybody else around the world is going to say, well, let's have our government take control of that private central bank and do the same thing that's working for Russia. And, of course, that was the reason everybody ganged up on Adolf Hitler, because he kicked out the private central bank imposed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles and created a new value-based currency, one that wasn't borrowed at interest from a private central bank. And Germany's economy just lit up. It was called the German Miracle. Time magazine made Hitler their Man of the Year for 1937 because of this amazing transformation, where Germany had gone from this country suffering under hideous inflation and poverty and starvation, and all of a sudden it was a manufacturing powerhouse just because he got rid of the private central bank. And, of course, that made him the instant enemy of every other private central bank everywhere on planet Earth. Right. And these private central banks turned around to their governments, who are slaves to the debt, and said, you will go and kill this upstart because we can't have this example in the world. It'll give the ultimate slaves, the ordinary people, uppity ideas about getting rid of private central banking.
Right. And another thing that Russia has chosen to do, which I think is great, they've chosen to be growing non-GMO food, and the world is beating a path to their doorstep for it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and this dovetails into my next article, which is that EPA chief's refusal to ban brain-damaging pesticide shows profit trumps public safety. And what this guy did, gentleman's name is Pruitt, defying the recommendation of his own agency's scientists. Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Scott Pruitt has refused to ban a widely used pesticide that has been linked to learning disabilities in children. Pruitt's order, signed late Wednesday, allows chloropyrifos, an organophosphate insecticide that's been used on crops from broccoli to cranberry since the 60s, to remain on the market for agricultural use. The EPA proposed in November of 2015 under the Obama administration to permanently ban the chemical on food crops, citing potential risks to human health. The move stemmed from a 2007 petition filed by the Natural Resources Defense Council and the Pesticide Action Network North America. This makes me very uncomfortable. Anything that is linked to learning disabilities in children, it shouldn't be anywhere near the food chain. But as consumers, we have the absolute right to protect ourselves and those we love from these harmful chemicals. Now, wherever you buy your vegetables, take a note of what company produces them. Call them and find out if those veggies or fruits are sprayed with, help me out with this, chloropyrifos or glyphosate. Glyphosate. And persist politely in these phone calls until you get an answer one way or the other. Go back to where you buy your fruits and vegetables and politely tell them that you no longer can buy them because they are sprayed with harmful chemicals which have been proven to cause brain damage in children.
Well, here's the problem. We've reached a point right now where it's almost impossible to find any food that isn't contaminated with these toxic chemicals, all in the name of maximizing profitability. And it's another sign of just how incredibly corrupt our entire establishment has become, where concerns about safety and health just aren't a factor. We have literally devolved to a society in which if it makes money, it's good, If it's not making money, it's bad, and there are no other considerations. I was just looking on the Fox News feed here, and even they're talking about this epidemic of opioid abuse, and they're talking about prescription opioid abuse, where doctors and pharmacies are prescribing this stuff and selling it, knowing it is addicting, and knowing that once they can get a patient hooked on it, the money will continue to flow forever. And frankly, I'm having a really hard time finding the line between the illegal drug industry and the legal drug industry.
I hear you. I hear you, dear.
Okay.
And that kind of leads into my next article. There is a new law which was passed very quietly in December, which means you could be the subject of a vaccine or medication experiment without your informed consent.
Yeah, we talked about this one a little while ago, and basically up until this law, the idea was that you, if you were going to be a subject for a medical test of any kind, the doctor, practitioner had to sit down with you and say, we're going to be trying out something new on you. We think it may do this. It could also have these negative impacts. Is it okay if we proceed? And you could say yes or no. This new law is basically a gift to the pharmaceutical industry to test on people without their knowledge.
Yeah.
Because the new law is that the informed consent is waived if it's determined that the experimental drug or treatment poses only minimal risk to the patient.
But how do they know that, Michael?
Well, apparently
That's
it's
the
up to
problem.
the pharmaceutical companies and the doctors to decide. There is no actual definition of what they consider minimal risk, you know, and they could be experimenting with a drug that causes your arms to fall off, but that's a minimal risk because you're still going to have your legs. And, you know, carried to an extreme. Again, look at the Tuskegee syphilis experiment to see what these people can do. We're going to take a break for commercials. Back with the last segment of our program after these few words. Actually, don't call. The lines are still closed. This is our last segment of the program today on this Pauhana Friday here. We're going to do a couple more stories and then do our sign-off here. Your next story.
This comes to us from Zero Hedge, and it's titled The Ticking Time Bomb That Will Wipe Out Virtually Every Pension Fund in America. And it talks about people thinking that they're secure with their pensions. And Bloomberg apparently published an editorial entitled Pension Crisis Too Big for Markets to Ignore. And what it did was it simply confirmed what a lot of people already knew to be true. Apparently, pension funds all over this country are terribly underfunded, and they have been pouring mind-boggling amounts of money into very risky investments, such as investment stocks and commercial mortgages. Just like the subprime mortgages of 2008, this is a crisis that everyone can see coming, and there's nothing that seems to be getting done about it.
Well, here's the problem, okay? Pension funds are constrained by law against getting into investments that appear to be risky. And if they're investing in risky investments, it's because somewhere there's a rating agency that has said, no, this is not risky, this is AAA. And we saw this happen during the mortgage-backed security fraud in 2008, where Wall Street's rating agencies, Standard & Poor's and all the rest of those, except for Egan-Jones, who got shut down, we're all saying these are AAA. These mortgage bundles are AAA. The fraud imploded, and pensions that had invested in these supposedly AAA investments were left without funds. And because nobody has the courage to stand up and point the finger at Wall Street, what's been going on is the pension funds are now having to reduce payments to these workers who spent their lives paying into the pension funds, and now they're not getting back the money they need for the retirement they thought they were planning for. And the problem is apparently still continuing. And it really is, we're at the end of this Ponzi scheme. And unfortunately, I feel really bad for our fellow baby boomers who are about to realize their pensions are on the verge of collapse. The money in Social Security you thought was going to be there for your retirement has been borrowed away by a government that doesn't have a snowball's chance in the dark regions, chance of ever paying it back. And it is a crisis. And unfortunately, as is always the case under fascist economic dictatorships, The pain is always going to be dropped on the most vulnerable segment of our society, which in this case are the elderly people.
Yep.
They're just going to be thrown out of their homes, and we're going to have a whole new elderly homeless population in the streets, and they're going to be at risk. And maybe that's how they're going to solve the problem. Cut off the pensions, put them out in the streets, let them die off from exposure, sell the bodies for the fertilizer plants or wherever they do with the dead homeless people, and problem is solved. But unfortunately, we have seen this coming on for 100 years, ever since the private central bank was created, and we've certainly seen it accelerating for the last 30 years with the loss of our manufacturing, and certainly with that GMO disastrous experiment. Okay, there's the music. It's time for us to get on out of here. So we're going to say goodbye. Have a good weekend. Again, please share what you learn on this radio show and our website with everybody that you know. We need to shout down the paid liars, the prostitutes, the correspondents, the propagandists who are trying to take us back to a world of illusion and post-truth in order to control us. We'll be back on Monday. Aloha, America.